Secretary Buttigieg, it's so nice to see you, and I am so appreciative for you joining us today.
Well, same here. A pleasure to be with you, and I also appreciate you all accommodating my ability to join you virtually. I wish I could be with you in 3D, but we're preparing to go testify on Capitol Hill. I do just feel a real affinity with the mission of this effort, so I'm glad to be able to speak with you today.
Well, thank you. You know, Transportation Infrastructure Secretary was the founding mission of the Appalachian Regional Commission. And it's something that is obviously so very important to the everyday lives of people across the United States. As we move toward the future of transportation, what's the Department of Transportation doing on this federal level to ensure our Appalachian communities are not left behind?
Well, this is something that's very much on our mind here at the department and a big area of focus for us because we're in a season that I think will come to be remembered in American history as our infrastructure decade. The proportions of the funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law are enough to really change the trajectory of American transportation infrastructure. But in our view, that is only going to be a success if it reaches everybody, if communities are not left behind. And certainly there are a lot of stories, communities in Appalachia that were not included in the economic growth that has happened in our country in decades past. And we know that economic growth relies so much on good infrastructure that this is a chance to address that. Part of that is reflected in specific and dedicated funding that is in the bipartisan infrastructure law. For example, annual funding for the ADHS, the Appalachian Development Highway System, was increased to total $1.2 billion in 11 states over the next few years. And also, there are a number of programs that I think hold particular promise over and above what is already specifically marked off or dedicated to regional projects like ADHS. We have the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Programs, especially focused on communities where we know we can increase connectivity, we can improve safety, we can spur economic growth. But the kinds of communities that didn't always get a lot of attention federally, often because the applicants were small communities or lower income rural counties. And that's exactly why we set up this program. We've just gone through the first year of the program, already 3 projects in the Appalachian region. There was one in North Carolina, $10.4 million headed to that part of rural North Carolina to deliver mobility and transit solutions. A project in Snyder County, Pennsylvania, the Central Susquehanna Valley Transportation Project, $69 million headed that way. And then in West Virginia, the Coalfields Expressway Project, we got $25 million headed that way that we know is going to make a positive difference there. So those are just a few examples of what we have in mind when we talk about putting our money where our mouth is and making sure that Appalachia is not left behind. We know that these changes aren't happening overnight. It's going to take a lot of commitment, not just the funding that we've announced, but seeing those projects through, getting them constructed, getting through all the steps that it takes before people can take advantage and ride that new transit route, drive on that new road. That's exactly what we're working on right now. And that's why I think this is a great moment for this effort.
Well, Secretary, you certainly have brought to light something that we all recognize, and that President Biden has been wonderful in understanding and knowing the needs of rural America and the people that live there. And when he recently, so the money that has already come down to the states through the ARC and through all of our federal agencies are certainly making a difference. So President Biden recently released his fiscal year 2024 budget, which includes funding for safety across all modes of transportation. And I know one of your major initiatives at the Department of Transportation has been a national roadway safety strategy. So how is the DOT focusing on transportation safety? And of course, I would say specifically in Appalachia, but I think transportation safety is probably universal, but how do you see that affecting maybe Appalachia specifically?
Well, the safety is the number one reason why our department even exists. It's the primary role of federal government with regard to transportation. It's a role we take very seriously across every mode of transportation, whether it's aviation safety, which has been in the news a lot as we work to understand the reasons behind some of the close calls that have been happening at American airports. Still very rare, but needs a great deal of attention. Railway safety, which has impacted so many communities. And I know Youngstown is not that far from the community of East Palestine, where I was recently talking to people on the ground about how we can make sure things like that are prevented in the future. And certainly roadway safety. Now, the strange thing about roadway safety is that it doesn't get the level of attention that other modes of transportation do. You know, we rightly would pay a lot of attention if there were to be a fatal airliner crash. But the equivalent of a fatal airliner crash happens every single day in America when you look at the loss of life in car crashes. We're talking about roughly 40,000 people a year. It's on par with gun violence. And I think the only reason we're not up in arms about it is that the numbers are so great, the stories are so many, the fact that every single one of us can think of people we know who've been lost in car crashes, that we're used to it. Almost as if we were a society that grew up going through a war. We just think of it as something that happens in life, but it doesn't have to be. So the philosophy of our national roadway safety strategy is that accidents, crashes are preventable if we take the steps that are needed to prevent them. That means safer roadway design. It means safer vehicles. It means safer people and drivers. It means safer speeds, and it means a higher standard of post-crash care, kind of emergency services that are activated when there is a crash. But we knew as we were putting together the president's infrastructure bill and the budget that it wasn't going to be enough just to go around shouting that message from the rooftops, that we had to put our federal money where our mouth is about the importance of this. And that's what we've done. One of the programs in this infrastructure law that we have already now done 1 year's worth of funding on in the 5-year life of the bill is called Safe Roads and Streets for All. We funded construction grants and planning grants, about a dozen in Appalachia, in communities across the region, to significantly reduce serious injuries and deaths on highways, on roads, and on streets. But the other thing I would point to, especially because I know we are addressing an audience of leaders who are deeply involved and engaged in the civic life of your community, your region, your state, and your county, is to recognize that while we're pushing hard on this at the federal level, a lot of the key decisions are actually going to be made closer to home. So the progress report that we just issued on our national roadway safety strategy points in part to what local leaders can do to improve safety in rural areas. And I strongly agree with you that safety is universal. And yet we also see in the data that some areas and some communities are more susceptible, more likely to experience losses of life and crashes than others. And rural America is part of where we see often the greatest risk. So we need to be working with stakeholders, the state level, local level, tribal level, through bodies like the ARC. We're ready to do our part again with technical assistance, with training, a lot of research going on as well on everything from technology to human behavior. But this is something where we are really eager to partner with local communities. Indeed, the program I just described, Safe Roads and Streets for All, that's not us sitting here at the DOT headquarters in Washington, D.C. and Navy Yard thinking up the right answer for a community in the middle of the country or anywhere in the country. It's us reviewing ideas and applications that come in from communities. So it's a very bottom-up approach to identifying solutions. We don't think the solutions all come out of this building, but we think more of the funding should. And that's exactly what we're doing with this program, and would invite anybody who's listening here to think about that, that shocking fact of the level of harm that we unfortunately have come to accept on our roadways. And imagine how different it would be if we treated it as unacceptable as a fatality on an airliner or a train or any other mode of transportation.
Well, Secretary, I think you make so many strong points about this. You know, you there has been obviously much money dedicated to programs, much thought given to ways that we can enhance safety. But I think at the end of the day, it becomes that each one of us need to be a part of that process. We need to be a part of the solution, in that we each have to play our part in what we do on roadways or whatever mode of transportation that we might be on. What can we do to be responsible and to act more safely? And then the efforts that are made at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. But it really is a team effort. I look out at this audience that we are with today. This is an audience of leaders among our communities who are always looking for better ways to enhance their communities, their programs, their education, their healthcare, and certainly infrastructure becomes such a critical part of the life that we live and how we navigate from point A to point B. And as you talked about the money that has been leveraged, it's important to note that more than $9 billion has been awarded through the Department of Transportation to more than 800 projects in communities all across America. And so you look at these projects and this money, and you talked a little bit about what is available at our local level for leaders, just like the ones that we're speaking before today. But is there any personal or particular advice that you would give to these local leaders in terms of how to go about obtaining federal funding, to find out about the type of support that's available for transportation projects in our Appalachian communities?
For sure. And I'm from a community that has some differences from Appalachian communities, but some similarities too. The city that I was mayor of didn't have the means to have a full-time staff dealing with federal relations and navigating grant programs. And I know how a community can feel sometimes daunted by these federal processes. So it's very important to us to be user-friendly to the kinds of communities that you are leading in and serving in. I would encourage you to look for any number of grants that could be relevant. There are literally dozens of programs just on the transportation side alone, just created by the infrastructure law alone. And some of them are multi-billion-dollar programs that we'll be making hundreds of project awards a year out of. So we're putting more and more information out in digestible form online with websites like build.gov and the Department of Transportation's own website. But we're also working with partners closer to the ground to help play that role of navigating the process. We have toolkits through an initiative called Routes, which is an acronym. The R is for rural. The Routes initiative here at DOT is specifically about making some of those connections. Would definitely encourage you to engage with the Routes team, especially if you're with an entity that wants to put together a consortium to go after one of these safety grants, or have had your eye on a road improvement or a community improvement for a long time and think it might be eligible now for our RAISE program, which can do grants up to $25 million. And if you think you only have the time or capacity to go for one of these, make sure it's the right one and work with us to do that. We are really leaning into the technical assistance and the hands-on support. The other thing I would say, and where you already have such a leg up based on the nature of the leadership represented in this room, is to get that community engagement right early and often. A lot of DOT funding recipients, because you're getting federal dollars, then have to go through these procedures to make sure you're meeting federal requirements. The more public involvement happens, the earlier that public involvement happens, the more smoothly that process goes. And so as the folks who are often closer to the ground level have an understanding of what people care about in your community, even know just who to reach out to solicit the kind of public input you need to look at alternatives on anything from taking an old rail line and turning it into a multi-use trail that's also going to bring economic benefits, to identifying a safety hotspot that has led to crash after crash after crash, and trying to get the funding to put a different kind of signal in there, or anything in between. Work with us because we are very eager to work with you.
Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to share this valuable exchange of ideas. ARC